Is Dricus du Plessis a racist, or is Israel Adesanya just making some wild claims that have no real truth to them? Let's find out in this video right now. So, last night at the official weigh-ins for UFC 305, which takes place Saturday, August 17th, Israel Adesanya is going to be taking on Dricus du Plessis, and the whole battle surrounding this, the whole feud, the whole rivalry going on, seems to be, from Israel's side, that it's a complete black and white issue, while Dricus, on the other hand, is just trying to promote the culturalism within Africa as a whole and try to unify the country and the continent as a whole. South Africa is where he comes from. That is his country. Israel Adesanya grew up until he was about 12 years old, 10 years old, somewhere around that age, in Nigeria, and then moved to New Zealand. So, last night, I will play the clip. This is what Israel had to say when answering a question from Dan Hellie on the UFC 305 weigh-in show. Here we go.
305 weigh-in show. Izzy, good to see you. Good to have you back. When you don't fight in 11 months, it feels like 11 years for us fight fans out here. I'm curious, the time off, was it helping you more spiritually or physically?
Excuse me? Everything. Physically, mentally, and even spiritually in a sense, because I got to remove myself from the game and find myself again.
Were you surprised how heated the press conference got yesterday and how emotional it was for you?
A little bit, yeah, because it's been a while since I've been here, but it was, speaking on my, like he said something, I was like, what the fuck are you on about? But I get...
So, to rewind back to the press conference, I covered it in an earlier video, but the real issue started to arise when Dricus was throwing his jabs, taunting Izzy, trolling Izzy with some little jabs relating to the history that he has spoken about himself, which I'll get to in an article in just a few minutes. But Dricus, the real problems arose when a guy came up and asked a question about the culture and the whole rivalry. Dricus mentioned the servants that Israel had when he grew up, and he said, are you going to bring them back to Africa when you go to visit? And then Israel got very upset and saying, you don't know who I am, you don't know what that means, yada, yada, yada. You don't understand me, you don't know my story, you don't know me, and he starts screaming. He's crying at this point. So here's Israel answer to the response to this question.
The internet and their stupid, comments. He said something about my servants, and that's rich coming from someone who owned slaves back in the day. So for me, it just...
So, is he really saying that Dricus had slaves? I think I know that he doesn't mean that, but he's definitely trying to insinuate that either Dricus, his family, or his ancestors of some sort had slaves. Is this true? I cannot confirm that, yes or no. Not in my wheelhouse. I don't know Dricus' literal family lineage. I know that he came to Africa, settlers from Europe. Yes, there was the whole deal with apartheid. Terrible stuff went on there. But Dricus and his family, I highly doubt were directly involved, and I highly doubt that they are racist people. Let me show you where Dricus grew up. He grew up in Hatfield, Pretoria, here in South Africa, as you can see. Not way down South Africa, the middle of South Africa, much closer to the border of other countries. Pretoria, a city. Hatfield, a fairly urban area. This is not the middle of the country, a rich neighborhood out here in the suburbs. He grew up in a pretty urban area. Does that mean that they are rich? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know the history of Dricus' family specifically. I did not get into that. He does not have the same kind of media coverage that Israel has gotten in the past couple of years because he's just not on that level of popularity. They're not trying to push him. You could go and look and do the research for yourself, yes. But the point is, Dricus did not grow up in some rich neighborhood way out in the countryside, secluded, gated community. He grew up right there in the middle of the city. So, I highly doubt that Dricus owned slaves. I highly doubt that Dricus' parents owned slaves. Again, I don't think this is what Israel's saying. But what it seems like is he's just taking this narrative of like all white people bad. White man bad. White man has slaves. White man had slaves. Well, guess what, Israel? There were a lot of slavers in Africa. African tribesmen that were heads of the clan that sold off other Africans, sold them into slavery. And there's a whole terrible history around that. And it was a way for them to make money and them to survive. And so they captured and sold off their own people to, yes, probably the white man in many cases, because they were the ones traveling the world. Great Britain was in charge of a lot of the world. They covered and conquered a lot of the world. And this, I hate to see it because it's just causing this rift in the community, and it's awful. And he just shouldn't be. And Israel just seems to be brainwashed with this crazy idea that, I don't know, is it like all white people are bad? No, because he trains with a bunch of white dudes in New Zealand. It's like he doesn't know where to fit in. He grew up pretty rich, pretty well off in Africa, as he says in this interview done by Jazzy. And honestly, this little girl right here does a lot better with the questions than most of the MMA media. So good for her. Maybe we should get her back in the spotlight doing some of these, going to the press conferences and asking questions. Here we go. Here's his answer.
So, I know that you were born in Nigeria and are very proud of your African culture. So, how did your Nigerian upbringing help mold your warrior mentality in the octagon?
For me, I grew up in an affluent household, so my parents were quite well off. But there was a lot of struggle around me from the people that, were living in the streets. People from the lesser, I guess, fortunate families, but also my ancestry. I know who.
So, again, I talked about this in the previous video. There's nothing wrong with that. Israel was fortunate enough to be raised in a household that had some money. He grew up in a place where there was also some poverty around, but he himself grew up well off, maybe not completely secluded and completely away from the poverty, but he definitely knew it was around when he was younger. But he was fortunate to be brought up in a household that had money. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem arises is now that he has spun himself into this web of, ooh, Dricus bad, ooh, white man bad. When that's not the case, man. This doesn't have anything to do with that. I just showed you where Dricus lives. Again, did he have money when he grew up? Probably, obviously, because it costs money to get into MMA. Was he rich? Probably not. Israel himself was not a high-class, rich, multi-millionaire type of family. He came from an upper-middle-class family. Here's an article written in 2021. So it was a little background information. What does Israel Adesanya's parents do for a living? And it says right here, the former two-time UFC middleweight champion is the son of Femi Adesanya. Adesanya Sr. is an accountant by profession and has seen his son make a name for himself in the UFC. So he was an accountant. Israel, at the press conference the other day, spoke about how they used to clean the floors at the banks, wake up at 4 a.m. and how terrible that was, which, again, I don't really understand how it's so terrible to wake up at 4 a.m. You grew up in a well-off household. You didn't live off somewhere where you had to walk a long way to get to where you needed to work and then work a long shift. It sounded like you just maybe cleaned the floors and then your dad would go to work at the bank. Maybe that's what the situation was. I don't know the specifics of it. Again, this isn't really the point here. So let's go back to 2020. Before Israel Adesanya was set to take on Yoel Romero at UFC 248 in February, Adesanya was a rising star, right? And here's ESPN cover story. Lots of promotional imaging here. Great photography. Great article. Very interesting. Gives you some background to Israel. Is very interesting. Cool to see where he comes from. Growing up in Africa, but not being an impoverished African and showing the perspective that he has on life. It was a great article. I really enjoyed it. And I remember seeing this back in the day. I didn't really read it with much note, but here it is. Again, before UFC 248. There's some videos. Here he is back in 2020 after his knockout of Robert Whittaker. And here we get into a little bit of the history. So, you can go check this out. It's on ESPN's webpage. Israel Adesanya, the UFC's next big thing, written through ESPN. So here we go. Here's a little bit of the history here. He was born in Lagos, Nigeria in 1989 to an upper middle class family, the first of 5 children, so he's the oldest kid. Although the country's civil society buckled under rising corruption and successive juntas and coups in the 1980s and 90s, the Adesanyas lived in relative comfort. So despite, like exactly what Israel was talking about, there was poverty and struggle around him, but luckily he was able to grow up in a nice, affluent household. Again, nothing wrong with that, Israel. I don't understand why you're trying to hide from that and shy away from this. And here's, again, this is out of Israel's own mouth. This is not a quote. This is written by a guy who wrote this article, but he took this from Israel. He sat down and did an interview with him, okay? This is from Israel's own mouth that he put in his own words and gave a great background and a history of Israel Adesanya's family. I thought it was an interesting read. I'm sure many people thought this was an interesting read. It gave some background to why this guy who's representing Nigeria has a New Zealand accent. It's always interesting to hear people's backstory and where they come from and why they are the way they are. Always interesting. So, here we go. Again, MMA Guru was making fun of this whole thing. And here it is, in literal writing, right here. Young Israel didn't learn how to bathe himself until he was 8. He recalls, when he insisted he no longer needed the aid of the family's domestic servants, plural, servants, plural. He was 8 years old. Again, MMA Guru was making fun of this, calling it pathetic, this and that. I get it. It is funny. You can't deny that. But that's how he grew up. He grew up with servants because his family was well off. If I had to make an assumption, make a guess, maybe there were people that were living in poverty around him and his family had a good amount of money. And so out of the kindness of their hearts, his mom was a nurse and his dad was an accountant. So they were making quite a bit more money than others maybe around them. So they found people that they trusted, maybe family friends that weren't making a lot of money, and they had them come take care of the 4 or 5 kids that they had at the time. What the heck's wrong with that? I don't see anything wrong with that. That's probably a really good thing and supportive of the community from Israel's parents. I don't get why he's shying away from this. He probably had a great relationship with these domestic servants that he had. Again, plural, servants. It wasn't just one person. So they were probably doing a really good thing for the community. I just have a problem with Israel trying to hide from this and pretend that he's something he's not. Trying to lump himself in there with Abdul Razak Al-Hassan and Francis Ngannou, when in truth, he's more like Dricus himself. Somebody who grew up with enough money to just live a comfortable life. I don't get what's wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just sad to see him spinning it with this race narrative, and I don't understand. I don't see Francis coming out and saying bad things about Dricus. I don't see Kamaru coming out with the same level of animosity. Yes, Kamaru's spoken on it, but that was also at a time when Kamaru had the welterweight strap and could have potentially been fighting Dricus if he moved up to middleweight. But he's kind of backed off since then. He still supports Izzy. He's still Izzy's friend. They both grew up in Nigeria. There's some camaraderie there. And Francis also was another African champ at the time. But it's just sad to see the whole split. I hate to see this whole racial divide between us because everybody has their own story to tell. And Israel's story is already out there, right? It's already out here. The UFC's next big thing. A whole entire article written by a guy. Let me get his name. Can't even pronounce it myself. Did an article on Russell Wilson, Anthony Joshua, and I think he's a good writer. I like this article. It's pretty good. But I just hate, he wasn't spinning some kind of race narrative in an article, pushing something that isn't real. Israel Adesanya is just making stuff up at this point. And I just hate to see it. It's really sad. I think most normal people in the world love and respect everybody and want to know and understand where everyone is coming from and try to meet people where they are in life and come together and learn more about each other. It's interesting to learn more about each other's cultures. It always is, because you get a perspective on life that you didn't know was a real thing, right? You've lived your life this way. Maybe you grew up in poverty and you are just interested to see how the rich person lives that you maybe see on a rare occasion. Or maybe you're like Izzy, where you grew up in a more affluent household and you're curious how it is to live in an impoverished state because you want to understand the person. You want to be able to help the person. You want to grow the person. You want to teach the person how life is outside of your own personal bubble. That's what being a human is, and that's what being a child of the earth. This is exactly what Izzy said the other day at the press conference. This is all good stuff. I don't think Izzy deep down is an evil person, but I think he's been corrupted in his mind by all this crazy political scheming that's going on throughout the world, creating this race divide of trying to split everybody up. And yeah, it's kind of fun for the fight promotion aspect of it, the rivalry they seem to have, but Dricus just seems pretty calm, cool, and collected and confident in himself, and Israel just seems too caught up in the moment and very emotional and just frustrated, overly frustrated. Crying at the press conference out of anger. Like, it takes a lot to make somebody cry out of anger. I've done it myself, but just disappointing to see overall. And I'm just excited. I want to see them throw down in the ring. I hope it's a good fight. It's going to be fun tonight. Great style matchup. Dricus comes to bang, crashes forward. Israel, the sniper on the outside. Let's see who gets it done. Let's get past all this BS. I hope that they, shake hands and, agree to disagree on whatever fronts they want. I hope they can just come together and learn to respect each other after they go through a fight. Let's see what happens. UFC 305.